He tried all sorts of different things that we now know as psychedelic in an effort to try to empathize, even in a temporary way, even in a kind of clumsy way, with patients that he felt were very difficult to connect with. This temporary suspension of your grip on reality allowed for what Osmond thought was a chemically inspired empathy with your patients that opened up new vistas.
Welcome to Intonicated, a podcast about psychedelics, learning, and well-being. Intonicated is an adjective that describes a heightened, expansive, and health-affirming state of consciousness marked by clarity, vitality, and integration, in which a person feels inwardly attuned and stretched towards deeper awareness, emotional resonance, or spiritual growth. I'm your host, Ken Tupper. Please be sure to like or subscribe. Hi there. Welcome to Intonicated, a podcast about psychedelics, learning, and well-being. And joining me today is my friend and colleague, Erika Dyck, Dr. Erika Dyck from University of Saskatchewan. But Erika, would you like to introduce yourself more fully?
Sure. Thanks, Ken, for having me on today. As Ken mentioned, my name is Erika Dyck. I'm a professor of history and a Kenneth Research Chair in the history of health and social justice at the University of Saskatchewan. And I've been working on the history of psychedelics for going into 3 decades almost.
Wow, okay, lots of historical knowledge to draw on, so I look forward to the conversation. I wanted to start off actually just because we're recording this mid-June 2026, and this week an MP from Saskatchewan, Corey Tucker, introduced a private member's bill, Bill C-286, or Thomas's bill as he calls it, to potentially amend the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act to allow for psilocybin to be used as a medical drug and therapy. So the question I had for you is, the roots of psychedelics in Saskatchewan go far deeper than that. I was wondering if you can tell us a bit more about the background, actually going back to who's Tommy Douglas and how did he initiate psychedelic research in Canada?
Yeah, it's funny, it was on my mind this week as I was watching the news reports of the private member's bill introduced by a Conservative member of Parliament, in alignment with a patient advocate and patient himself, Thomas Hartle, who I got to know a little bit as well. It's interesting to see how much psychedelics have crossed the ideological spectrum. And in the 1950s, it was, of course, with the CCF, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, that became the NDP, that was really championing the use of psychedelics in Saskatchewan. And of course, that's where the word psychedelic was coined.
And just for folks who aren't in Canada or don't know, the NDP is our sort of left-leaning political party.
The New Democratic Party is supposedly the most electable on the left, although that could be open for debate these days. But we'll just say in the very generic and superficial historical sense that they are our kind of left-leaning party. And they were forged in the prairies, forged in terms of their electoral success in the prairies in the 1940s. And their leader championed both democratic reforms that sat on the left of the political spectrum, but sort of a chief feature of that was Medicare, or a publicly funded healthcare system. And so for Tommy Douglas, who was both premier and health minister during the 1940s, one of his promises was not only to reform healthcare, but to bring it into alignment with these kinds of ideological features. And for him, focusing on reforming psychiatry was really personal. He'd worked in a mental hospital, and his home constituency housed the largest mental hospital in Western Canada at the time. And he was very keen on making these reforms. And it's he who then, he and his staff, of course, who kind of created a bit of an ideological magnet in the province, drawing people in, including a number of psychiatrists, psychologists, and social workers who were keen on also engaging in mental health reforms.
He was actively recruiting physicians from the UK and other, he was really trying to bring a bit of a brain trust to Canada and the prairies.
Absolutely. I mean, I think in part, responding to the leeching away of professional classes during the Depression and even into the wars, on either side of the wars, he was really trying to draw people back in by giving them things like stable research funding or a little bit of professional autonomy relative to their colleagues in other places to explore, innovative solutions for, in this case, the mental health crisis at the time, which was a preponderance of people living in large-scale mental hospitals. This is where Humphrey Osmond comes from. He's a British trained psychiatrist. He allegedly saw an ad in the Lancet placed there by Douglas or his team and was recruited into Saskatchewan, something his wife never fully forgave him for, I don't think, according to their children. But she came from, outside of London, England. They moved their family to Saskatchewan, and Osmond set off to be both the superintendent of a large-scale asylum or mental hospital, but also he came with already an abiding interest in psychotic disorders and what you could learn from entering into a temporary state of psychosis yourself. And for him, that was the avenue for exploring what would later be called psychedelics. He's the person who coins that word.
Yeah, yeah. And do you know how he first encountered LSD? Is there a record of that story, his own first experience and what he got from it?
I can't confidently say that there's a first, like which one is the first time. There are certainly records, both in his personal record collection, but also in the correspondence with others about his experiences. I'm not confident that I've identified which one is the first, but certainly.
Yeah, he had some experiences that led him to think this was a promising
Absolutely.
psychiatric medication.
And what I always found quite compelling about his initial foray into this field was the way that he very quickly looked to patients to help to verify these experiences. So he would work with patients. He was one of the co-founders of an organization called Schizophrenics Anonymous, kind of based on that 12-step Alcoholics Anonymous program, to develop and facilitate this kind of community response to what is it like to live with these episodic psychotic experiences, and how do you make sense of it, and how do you navigate the world in that way. And this was a really empowering gesture. Osmond really felt that way with LSD, mescaline. He tried mescaline before LSD. He tried all sorts of different things that we now know as psychedelic in an effort to try to empathize, even in a temporary way, even in a kind of clumsy way, with patients that he felt were very difficult to connect with. It was hard to get talk therapy working with someone who was having a delusion, perhaps, that you weren't actually there or that you were something other than what you were, or who didn't want to leave their rooms because they felt that there were holes in the floor. It was difficult for staff to recognize that, but with a single session, sometimes with multiple sessions, this temporary suspension of your grip on reality allowed for what Osmond thought was a chemically inspired empathy with your patients that opened up new vistas for therapy.
So it was like a professional development tool more than a medication to apply necessarily to a patient at the outset.
Initially, that is certainly my impression of going through his records, that this was a sort of research avenue that wasn't applied to patients initially. It eventually was applied to patients, but in those initial stages, it was really around addiction, or to be clear, in the 1950s, we're talking about alcoholism.
Right. And can you speak a little bit to what, and he had colleagues Duncan Blewett and Abram Hoffer. Can you speak to what that team did with the pioneering research into LSD for alcoholism?
Yeah, so even in a way, coming back to Tommy Douglas, who kind of activated these research units by providing those tributaries of funding and creating regions that allowed for that kind of research. There were a number of pockets of research in Regina, Saskatoon, a little bit in Prince Albert, North Battleford, Swift Current, so smaller centers dotted around the province. But they were all connected in this network. And you imagine today, here we are speaking face to face, though, thousands of kilometers apart. So these are sort of painstakingly typed out by not these guys usually it's a secretary who's typing these things out. But this is why we have access to this information in part, is that there's a record of these communications. And then these research groups kind of formulated the kept around, I think they kind of clustered around this hive of ideas that psychedelics had some benefits, they produced insights, they changed consciousness, some of the language that we're kind of familiar with today. But they were very kind of naive in starting with this. They went to anthropological literature, they looked to other research units, they went to religious experiences, and were looking for evidence in the library, essentially, of different proxies into this. And quickly, they found through their own self-experimentation, and then work initially with patients who came in through the jail system often, but also into the psychiatric system for problem drinking, alcohol abuse, different language was used at the time, that these patients were actually showing tremendous promise with changes in insight from what by today's standards might be large doses, but were often single dose therapies in combination with something that, again, today we might recognize as formalized psychotherapy, but these people weren't left alone in rooms. They were with some kind of therapist. Sometimes that was a social worker. In some cases, based on the records, it seems that the person left in the room was often the person who came in to be the secretary, so the wife of a doctor who was there to support the smooth flowing of the operation, but the patient would sometimes ask the men to leave, leaving a single person in the room. So it's definitely not codified or standardized at this time. But the important thing is that even in this kind of clumsy way, there was an evolution of ideas around what was important to have in the room at the time. Music, artwork, access to a washroom, the things that we maybe today recognize as critical parts of our set and setting.
So I wanted to actually ask you about that and sort of come out to the West Coast. Can you tell us who was Al Hubbard and what influence did he have on the research team in Saskatchewan?
I remember Duncan Blewett telling myself and others that, Al Hubbard knew more in his pinky finger about LSD than most of the researchers in North America combined. That's, one way to put him. Michael Pollan describes him as the Johnny Appleseed of acid. And he has this kind of larger-than-life character that looms large in a number of history books and in people's memories. And, according to one of his biographers, or I think his biographer, Brad Holden, who works in Seattle, Hubbard was actually like a school dropout. I think he said he dropped out in like grade 2 or something. And forgive me, I don't remember exactly when, but like early, not, in high school or something. He was from Kentucky. He was this kind of like loud, crude, he kept a gun on his hip pocket, like this kind of Yosemite Sam character who kind of comes in blustery. He worked as a rum runner in Seattle for a while. But he flipped. He was a double agent. He worked for the CIA. He didn't work for the CIA. He told on them. And he seemed to kind of weasel his way through a variety of transactions that you'd think would leave someone else in jail, but somehow he managed to get through. He escapes into Canada during one of these escapades, and he turns his sights away from rum running and into psychedelics. He becomes extremely interested in LSD in particular. He allegedly, travels around with a briefcase of liquid Sandoz supplies, and it turns out other supplies as well. He also tried to pioneer the use of the carbogen tank, where he suggested that before anyone take acid or LSD, they take a huff of this carbogen that he would carry around in a tank to see how you would do, as a bit of a test.
Carbogen being CO2?
I think so. I have not come across this analogy in other writings. I've only seen it associated with Al Hubbard, and what I've come to appreciate is that not everything he says is true. So take this all with a grain of salt, but...
Do you know how he first got introduced to LSD? What his pathway to early experience?
It's a really good question. His name pops up in a few different places, and I find it interesting that as he becomes this larger-than-life character, a number of people kind of claim that they were the ones who introduced him. So I don't know where the truth lies, but he certainly intersects. He intersects with the Huxleys. He intersects with Timothy Leary. He intersects with Osmond. He comes to Saskatchewan seeking supplies, regulated supplies. So there's all these different places, but he also works with a pilot, and he shows up all over the world at different times. So I think that's a great question that I hope someday maybe someone, maybe other than me, will answer that with the more confidence. But he seems to kind of circulate through a vast network of psychedelic associates.
He was a pilot himself, didn't he? Have his own plane, and he had an island here. He owned his own island here in British Columbia off the coast of
Denman Island. Yes.
Yeah. No, not. I think
Damon
it's called
Island. Sorry.
Damon
yes,
Island.
I'm mixing those up. In fact, somebody bought the house that he lived in while I was writing the Acid Room book. And this was not something I was paying close attention to, but as they were taking down a wall, or perhaps even taking down the whole house, they found papers stuffed in the walls of the house and called us up so that we could access these records in the process of this. I mean, we'd been in touch with the archives. They contacted the archives, not us. But yeah, so the stories about this guy just kind of, you can't even make this stuff up. It keeps going, you think, this must be the truth. And then it's very slippery bottom. I think that's what Brad Holden found too when he was watching him through his Prohibition days, that he was a Prohibition sort of police surveillance person, but he was actually selling rum on the sly. So depending on where you look, you get different answers for what he was actually doing. So he's a slippery character, but definitely a colorful one.
Can you tell us more about the acid room and Hollywood Hospital and Ross McLean and I guess maybe the pathway? Did Al Hubbard influence Ross McLean's work there
Absolutely.
initially?
So Hollywood Hospital was a private hospital in New Westminster, British Columbia. It gets its name actually from the hollyhock bushes that grew outside of it, but it kind of, that lore continues as when Hubbard and others are associated with it, it becomes an elite treatment center using psychedelics, primarily LSD, some psilocybin, some mescaline. Those are the three primarily used at the time. And it gets this larger than this kind of storied past by suspicions that they are Hollywood film stars who were using this as a discreet dry out center. So they're working with alcoholics again with this kind of private clinic. You could pay, you could get a 3-night stay, for example, at Hollywood Hospital, and you would be treated by Dr. Ross McLean. And what my colleague Jesse and I found was that, in writing the book, was that Ross McLean kind of inherited an addictions facility that was a bit out of date. They were really struggling. Their financial records were in ruin. And Al Hubbard and others came along and pitched this idea of turning it into a psychedelic center. And that's kind of what turned its fortunes, but also elevated it in the popular press. There was a journalist specifically attached to Hollywood who was very keen on finding out what was going on in there. He, in fact, had his own experience and wrote about it. And this drew a lot of attention, including from some Hollywood stars. We know for sure, even though the records are not fully intact and we can't be 100% certain, we know for certain that at least one woman was a Hollywood actress who came there specifically to learn how to portray an LSD trip by going through a session at Hollywood Hospital. But if you'll find in the newspapers, if you go searching claims that Barbra Streisand was there, we don't have evidence of that. That Cary Grant was there, we also don't have evidence of that. But there were some 1950s singers, songwriters, local celebrities who did end up in that facility. But they're not quite as well known as, say, Barbra Streisand.
And it ended up closing down, I think, in the early 1970s. And I recall Rick Doblin saying that he was looking for a legal LSD experience early in his life, and that was around the time that it was closing. He was planning to go to Hollywood Hospital, but I think it closed before he was able to actually go and
That's
be a patient
fascinating.
there.
I haven't heard that story before, but my impression is that it kind of has this slow atrophying in part because getting access to legal supplies of LSD, and again, LSD was kind of the cheap one at the time, was becoming more challenging. It was when they shift more into psilocybin, but even that was becoming challenging. But one of the other issues was that as Medicare comes in, if we come right back to Tommy Douglas, as Medicare kind of rolls out across the country, or their publicly funded healthcare system, this private hospital was harder to justify in the space that was becoming increasingly funded through public access, and having a private hospital was no longer viable.
Interesting. Well, I was going to ask you the more sort of fulsome history of why psychedelic research got sort of terminated in the early 70s, or I mean, it started in the mid 60s. It was partly public backlash and concerns, but there was some regulatory issues going on as well, and changes in sort of philosophy of science and medicine. I was wondering if you can flesh that out a bit.
I think I'm trying to think back, and I don't know how much your listeners want to know here, but Ken and I met a few decades ago, and I probably would have had a different answer for you then. I think I was really drawn at that time to what I was seeing in the historical newspapers about the kind of moral panic that erupted over, psychedelic abuse, both kind of violence coming from that. We think about the Charles Manson murders really capturing front stage in terms of suggesting that psychedelics could cause a cult to emerge, a murderous cult in this case. So these kinds of really apocryphal stories are filling the newspapers and linking acid in particular, but psychedelics more broadly, to these really kind of horrific downfall stories. But I think over time, and partly with the greater access to new information, and partly with our capacity now to read more quickly, whether we lean into AI or can create databases, since the 1990s when we were doing it on cue cards, I think there's actually a mounting, my sense is that there's mounting evidence to suggest that there were scientific cracks in the edifice of psychedelic science already by the late 1950s, early 1960s. For example, the requirement that pharmacological substances go through randomized controlled trials really comes in the 1960s in the wake of some challenges we see with things like thalidomide or allegations about side effects of the birth control pill, or even like toxic poisoning from like Silent Spring, from Rachel Carson's argument that better living through chemistry actually poisons our environments. So DDT, absolutely.
Yeah.
The Green Revolution, the concerns that what we'd reached for as a savior for humanity, these chemical products or pharmaceutical products, actually had some pretty negative long-term consequences. And I think the kind of cooling of enthusiasm over better living through chemistry, to borrow the DuPont slogan, starts to creep into the scientific community in and around the early 1960s. So before Timothy Leary maybe even goes to Mexico to have his first mushroom experience, or before Charles Manson, starts a cult in California, before those kinds of stories that have often been used to suggest that this was the downfall of psychedelics, I think the genie was out of the bottle even a little bit earlier. And we see, for example, funding drying up, or we see exposés into the CIA-funded mind control experiments, that those stories are starting to break and starting to shift confidence among the research community about the capacity to use psychedelics safely or consistently or even effectively. And so by the time Leary loses his job at Harvard, or by the time these other popular stories kind of hit the headlines, there's already some reticence within the medical community, within the scientific community, and I think it's more difficult to support keeping psychedelics on track at that time, which is, a less exciting answer perhaps, but I think it's more plausible. And to me, it's really important because I think it helps us to monitor where we're at today, to recognize those shifts are really important.
Yeah, you mentioned some of the more nefarious work that was being done in the 1960s. Can you speak to Sidney Gottlieb's work and his funding of Ewan Cameron in Montreal, and tell us a bit about what you know?
I would recommend that people read Andy Roberts' book, The Poisoner in Chief. This is a book about Sidney Gottlieb, and you'll get much more than you will from me for sure. But just in deference to that work, and from what I've seen from the Canadian side of things, is, in one way the CIA is, and through figures like Sidney Gottlieb, there are agents who are involved in monitoring all sorts of activities, and psychiatry is kind of rife with the potential for mind control experiments. And we got to remember that in the 1950s and 60s, this is kind of the heyday of the Cold War. And so the fear of Russian spies, or Soviet spies, I should say, the fear of communists infiltrating different organizations is really sort of present on the minds of a number of researchers, and certainly in the funding community. So when it comes to psychiatry, being able to root out espionage, or to control one's mind, or to resist controlling having your mind controlled, is really important. Perhaps it might seem like the stuff of an HBO series now or something, perhaps. But I think this was really present, and you can see kind of the remnants of that in some of the language that you see in newspapers, as well as the reports that come out of these research units. So Ewan Cameron, interestingly, perhaps ironically, had been one of the delegates from Canada on the Nuremberg trials. So this person who's sort of held up as representing some kind of ethical or moral standing when it came to human experimentation. And a couple of decades later, a decade later rather, he is outed as having taken money from the CIA, which I don't think in and of itself was that bizarre. The CIA was funding a lot of things.
And he might not have known it was often sort of funneled through
foundation,
agencies.
There are all sorts of kind of I guess I think of it like shell company. Exactly.
Shell companies.
So whether or not he knew that this funding was coming from the Central Intelligence Agency or not, even if he did, it wasn't unusual. People take money from things. You're trying to get your studies off the ground, and sometimes that's a bit loose. What he was doing was involving a project that he called psychic driving, which was the idea that you could repattern someone's behavior. So imagine mashing together kind of psychoanalytical techniques with psychedelics. In this case, he would try to bring someone back into their infantile state, so like a pre-language state, infancy. He was working with women with postpartum depression, the most famous case, Val Orlico, made it to the news headlines because her husband then, David Orlico, who was a member of parliament for the New Democratic Party, sued Ewan Cameron and McGill University and Allen Memorial Hospital for their work in this way. For Val, whose story is the most well known, she was sort of brought into this infantile state, and then she was supposed to be repatterned through psychic driving using repeat doses of LSD and repeat messaging to create a new mantra for how she would see herself. You know, I am beautiful, I am beautiful, I am beautiful. My mother didn't see that, but I am beautiful. You can imagine a pattern like that that would try to get you out of some rutted thinking with a different kind of rutted thinking, we might argue. What happened was this worsened her depression, and there were a number of patients who had really tragic outcomes, including some deaths.
Yeah.
There was an inquiry, again, championed by, in this case, a politician, her husband, and Ewan Cameron was found to be at fault for, I don't think for accepting the money, but for engaging in behavior that was considered unethical, which again is rather ironic.
Yeah. They were using strobe lights and sleep deprivation. It wasn't just LSD, but it was part of a mix of things.
Yeah, we see this, there's a documentary film called In the Sleep Room that you can, or for Canadian viewers, you can get it from the National Film Board. You can read Anne Collins' version of it in a kind of dramatized novel. And if we take a step back, we can recognize that there are other features of this that play out in other jurisdictions. In Mexico, for example, Salvador Roquet is perhaps the most famous and well known for engaging in psychedelic therapy that many people recognize today, and probably at the time, as really a kind of constellation of torture and psychedelics. And those features, much like we were just discussing, some of those stories start to make the headlines in a way that also begins to challenge the enthusiasm around psychedelic therapy as something positive.
Right. Well, let's switch to something more positive. And I was wondering if you could actually tell me a bit about why you got interested in this topic yourself in the first place. What piqued your interest into researching the history of psychedelics and medical research in Canada?
People ask me this question and I think they want a more interesting answer. Like, I went to this concert, or it had this older sibling or something, but none of that is true. It's actually quite boring in some ways. I was working for a historian of science who was interested in the history of human experimentation, and I spent many hours, months in the basement of the University of Toronto Medical Library, and was sort of trying to find these different ways that humans had been used as instruments to determine, the effects of different things. And I immediately latched on to, I found these LSD studies, I latched onto it, I was very excited by it, but it took me a little while before I translated that into a PhD application. And while I was ruminating on what to do with my life, I was working at the time for the Minister of Justice in Saskatchewan, so I was working in government. I was toying with law school, and each of those prospects for me kind of had me hitting my head up against a wall, both in terms of trying to understand the ideological context in which these experiments took place historically, but also sometimes the limitations of both working in a bureaucratic system, like working as a civil servant, or working as a lawyer, some of the limitations to implementing a system of reform. And those ideas kept circulating in my mind. And then I worked in a law firm and I decided I didn't want to do that anymore. So I kind of ran back to the field of history. And to me, that was the most flexible canvas for exploring these ideas. Not that I was going to do it, as a civil servant, but I couldn't dislodge the interest and the enthusiasm for trying to understand, how did these, quite honestly, I think, how did these players who in the history books came across in some ways as quite conservative, how did they get behind championing something that seems so radical and that has a reputation for being, reform-minded and radical? And so it aligns with where we started the conversation in some ways, that in some ways it's not surprising to see a conservative MP championing this, because there are these kind of universal elements behind psychedelics that, I think they kind of invite these ideas about reform. And so I find that symmetry quite fascinating.
And so where are you at now in your sort of research agenda? What's keeping you up, and where are you planning to go? I presume you've got some students you're supervising, but your own research agenda.
Yeah, I've got a number. Finally now, this is like, I think my gosh, I can't even do math right now, but I've been in this position at the University of Saskatchewan since 2008. And I haven't had that many students who are interested in working on psychedelics. History of medicine more broadly, yes, but history of psychedelics has been a little bit slow coming, but now there are quite a few students interested in that area. So it just opens up the possibilities of not only following their exciting research tracks, but also looking at different kinds of collaborations that are possible when you have a whole team. So I've got two kind of main projects on the go, and mostly they're in my head, but I'll share with you the kernel of them at least. One of them, and Ken, you're involved in this one as well, is trying to think perhaps differently, but I really think there's a timely opportunity to capture kind of a history of psychedelic harm reduction. And I use that phrasing, recognizing that not everyone is going to agree that this is harm reduction, but that's something we'll play it with. The idea that communities of people, individuals, concert goers were completely reckless, I think, is not true. But I think there's a moment now to ignite the interest in capturing the kind of embodied history, the cultural history of how people learned how to take care of each other, both in legal context. So think back to 1960s Grateful Dead concerts, maybe Woodstock. There's still some people who participated in, First Aid Plus, and I think now evolving into peer support groups and looking at places like Shambhala, looking at Boom Festival, maybe Burning Man. There are other kinds of community formations that align with a recreational use. It does not go, maybe you're going there to self-medicate, but we don't think of these as clinical spaces. And yet there's a lot to be learned about caring for each other and kind of reducing risks, reducing harms, maybe even prevention, that I think would be very, very valuable if we are going to move into a context where, let's say, the private member's bill is accepted, even the medical green lighting of psychedelics probably will signal to some people that it's safe. And yet we all recognize, I think, readily that these are not benign substances either. And I think we have a lot to learn from those communities that have been working hard for generations to safeguard these practices and create guardrails that aren't codified in clinical terms. So I'm really excited about that. We'll do some interviews, we'll probably do some site visits, and we'll scour the archives for sometimes anonymous pamphlets and information about how to check your supplies, how to trust supplies, how to take care of each other, how much water to drink, how to get a sunburn.
Yeah, super interesting project, and I'm happy to be part of it. You mentioned other things, or I guess a similar question is, what if somebody granted you $10 million to do your own dream research for the next 5 years?
$10 million, that's wild. Then I'm just kind of I'll start with the second project and then I'll link it to the answer. The other project has been evolving over the last few years, and notably in the last 3 years, with a really concerted effort to work with First Nations communities in Saskatchewan, but more broadly, but our anchor point is Saskatchewan. And, I mentioned Humphrey Osmond at the beginning. In 1956, Humphrey Osmond sat in a Native American church ceremony in Saskatchewan, and it was the first group in Canada who was...
Can you explain what the Native American church is?
The Native American church is, so it's a pan-Indigenous, and it's a syncretic religion that incorporates elements of Christianity with traditional Indigenous uses. It starts legally. I mean, there are ceremonies that take place for a long time, but the kind of legal incorporation of the Native American church happens in Oklahoma in 1918 under the leadership of Quanah Parker, who's both a peyote chief, he's also a Comanche chief.
And their key sacrament is peyote, cactus that contains mescaline. Yeah, that's the anchor
mescaline
port.
was the first psychedelic substance that Aldous Huxley took. It's also the first one that Humphrey Osmond took. And they're also drawn to these ceremonial practices that, for them, were also really important to understand and appreciate. In 1956, Humphrey Osmond is invited to a peyote ceremony in Saskatchewan, and it's shy of 2 years since the community at that point, Red Pheasant and Mosquito First Nations, had signed letters of incorporation for the Native American Church in Canada. Just as a small footnote here, it's not only significant because peyote grows primarily in Texas and Mexico, so it's not growing in Saskatchewan, but it's a remnant of trade networks that have existed for a long time. But also, it's the first year that Canada allows First Nations people to retain lawyers. And one of the first acts in this group, at least, was to retain a lawyer to sort of solidify this legal permission. So I think that's really profound, really interesting. But having that legal permission didn't mean that Indian agents and RCMP officers didn't continue to harass these communities. And as one effort to sort of draw attention to this, the community invited Humphry Osmond, Duncan Blewett, Abram Hoffer, and Teddy Weckowitz, so researchers in Saskatchewan, to sit in a ceremony. In July of this year, we are going to mark the 70th anniversary of that ceremony. We're off by a couple months. But it's through working with the community descendants of the Native American Church in Canada, but also other peyote ceremonialists. So we have representatives coming from Mexico, from the Erika community. Those are, who do the Wirakuta pilgrimage. We have members from the Quechua community in Peru, Sacred Valley of Peru, members from Brazil coming. It'll be a meeting of Indigenous traditional ceremonialists across the Americas, as well as psychedelic researchers, partly in a recognition of the way that we've historically worked together and the opportunities we have when we work together. So not everybody agrees that non-Indigenous people should sit in a ceremony, and the family that's sort of at the core of this research, the Daniels family, very much feels that Humphrey Osmond sitting there benefited their family. He sat with their grandfather, and this is something that we want to open up and have conversation about and record. So that's kind of an ongoing long-term history project led by the community, so it will be what it will be, but it's been an incredibly humbling, and it's just been an honor to work with these families and almost start over again. All the things that I thought I knew about psychedelics in some ways go out the window, or at least get parked, as I try to enter into a new framework, a new space for trying to understand what it means to protect peyote for generations and for future generations.
Yeah. I mean, it's a modest step towards reconciliation and respect for, different kinds of epistemologies and ways of knowing.
Totally.
It's beautiful.
So if I had those $10 million, I would probably try to launch a plan for, there's so many things that I could say flippantly, but I think in seriousness, I've been kind of playing with this idea of a constellation of research projects that would be nested in this idea of the cosmic contexts of care. And by bringing different kind of knowledge systems together, so Indigenous contexts of care, and thinking about how that plays out, so not an Indigenous, but the diverse Indigenous ways that psychedelics, entheogens, that sacred plants, and we'll stumble over language here, but the way that these medicines have been used over time in different contexts, so putting those back into the community, putting them back into their culture, and trying to understand what they mean. That means engaging with language, and this is $10 million, so I'm going to do some language training. It's different cosmologies. It's a huge consortium of voices at the table for talking about that. So that's one C. The other C is my carnival care. So that's festivals, and because it's a C, I'd had to change it to carnival or allude to the Brazilian context, but really think about festival care, that harm reduction piece, because it's a whole other language, a whole different epistemology for understanding how do we manage psychedelics in that space. One would be clinical care. I think tracking protocols over time, tracking clinical guardrails, and tracking the debates that go on in those spaces as part of, but not as privileging over these other two contexts. And then the final one, I think, would be commercial. So looking at the global distribution networks of psychedelics, trade, and part of that is conservation, but it's also synthetics, it's also kind of scaling psychedelics. So that would, if I had endless time and energy and resources, I would love to think about this sort of larger constellation of different contexts in which we understand psychedelic care. And my big goal with that would be to start to really invest in how we might imagine a psychedelic space that is more sustainable, that instead of hiving it off and saying it can only be used in a clinical context with with two practitioners for 6 hours or whatever it might be, and that might be appropriate in one space, it may not be appropriate in another one, but to start putting those things on level playing ground so we can sort of talk across the disciplines or epistemologies.
Right. Weren't you also doing a global research project looking at sort of history of psychedelics, I guess, in multiple different national settings historically? Can you speak a little bit about that?
A few years ago, together with Chris Alcock, I worked on an edited volume on, we called it Expanding Mindscapes, and it was an attempt to do a kind of global history of psychedelics, Certainly not comprehensive, but examples of where psychedelic encounters have taken place around the globe. And we sort of strategically avoided Canada and the United States in an effort to sort of downplay some of those stories that have had more they've been more on the airwaves, they've had more airtime. But in cultivating that, I mean, there was a pandemic, so some of the projects that had a lot of potential weren't able to come to fruition. There were closures and travel restrictions, of course. So there are some notable gaps in the book, but I think there are also some kind of tantalizing leads. Tripping in Karachi was one of the contributions from a journalist student at the time. She's now completed, but who writes about Muslim experiences with altered states, and there's sort of an intersection here of thinking about gender and the privilege of recreational substances and what that means and the consequences. And it's a very personal story, but I think just sort of opens a small window into what is a whole world of thinking about intoxication, in this case in a Muslim context. Perhaps we don't think about that so much with psychedelics, or not regularly. But there are also articles about Ibogaine, which has been in the news lately, with Trump's executive order, evidence from the boutique community from an anthropologist, French anthropologist. There's stories about Brazil. So Brazil has its own kind of psychedelic moment with this kind of countercultural embrace of psychedelics. So not ayahuasca, the article's not about ayahuasca, but more about LSD in Brazil. But in what I'm appreciating is in a kind of Brazilian fashion, which is kind of twisting the narrative a little bit from what we think of from a North American perspective. There's a dictatorship going on, and to be countercultural with a dictatorship, you kind of have to find a different outlet for how you show protest. So looking at music and artwork and these other cultural expressions, I think the author Julio Del Manto does a fantastic job of showcasing how Brazil kind of refashioned psychedelics in its own way. So these kinds of stories, I think, just invite us to think about all of these places that have had these psychedelic encounters that we don't necessarily think of on the main track of psychedelic history.
There's probably lots more that could be done.
If I could remember all of them, I would tell them all off the top of my head.
No. I just think you probably scratched the surface of what's possible, and sort of further, finding people who have stories or oral histories of psychedelics in their own communities and jurisdictions.
I'll maybe just mention quickly that as part of that, of course, there were projects that we weren't able to see through, and I do hope that either that we could or somebody else could, pick up this track and do another version or do something like this. And I'll just acknowledge that, I see that Johns Hopkins is doing a lost histories, or forgotten histories rather. So maybe we'll see some more coming out in that regard. I'm not involved directly, but we've since found a researcher in Cairo, for example, who found a box of materials in the hospital suggesting that there were LSD trials taking place in Cairo in the 1950s. And, again, this is just one of those exciting moments where I think the softening of the discourses around psychedelics today, or the psychedelic renaissance, if you will, is allowing for these conversations to kind of bubble up to the surface as people are maybe less worried about getting in trouble for talking about it, or they're more open to donating these materials to an archive, thinking that there may be some enduring value. So it's a good time to be a psychedelic historian.
I think it reminds me of a book called The Chemical Muse. I think that Dan Hillman was
I don't know
author.
that
Do you
one.
know
That's
that book?
not good. It's not Rick.
He talks about how he was, as a grad student, discouraged from looking at anything involving psychoactive substances. Like there was this kind of deep freeze, and this is my own experience, and I think yours as well, through the 80s, 90s, into early 2000s. Talking about this subject in the academy was sort of a career ender. At least it wasn't at all tolerated or encouraged. There were no grants and very few supervisors. I mean, there were, of course, some notable exceptions, but largely it was, you were persona non grata for choosing a topic like this. And he spoke to a kind of process of what he called Bowdlerization, which is a term that's applied to a Shakespeare a guy who copied the works of Shakespeare in the 19th century, Victorian era England, and took out all the offensive material. So he rewrote Shakespeare to make it
Right.
acceptable for his peers, and he was doing this out of
Yeah.
good moral judgment. But this author, Dan Hillman, made the equivalency of Bowdlerization of drugs in history in terms of like ancient Rome and ancient Greece and their use of psychoactive substances just wasn't talked about by the scholars of the classics. It was like Bowdlerized, as he put it. I thought that was really
I think that is a poignant insight, and I think it absolutely aligns with some of the experience I've had, in my own graduate work. I know you and I had conversations, a long time ago about like you couldn't openly talk about these things, or you would run the risk of, two things. One is that there were career risks associated with it, but I think the other was, and again, I don't think you and I have actually had this conversation before, that the idea that you were studying psychedelics, there was a kind of expectation that you would probably take in psychedelics, and that would further undermine your judgment as a professional in some capacity. And that assumption, I think, has changed over time. I think the assumption that people who study psychedelics take psychedelics is still out there, but is no longer a discrediting feature. I think it's hovering on the fence, and maybe in some circles it's certainly a crediting feature. Like, how could you possibly work with these substances if you haven't tried them? But that kind of, I guess I just feel old in saying this, like having experienced the sense of judgment from studying psychedelics change over the course of the last 25 years. It's palpable, but it is also, I guess it maybe makes me a little bit nervous that it won't change back. And there's a risk, perhaps, in trying to ignite some of these stories right now, because I think, not that I think people should hide from this, but we know that the risks do not accrue, or the consequences don't accrue evenly. So, for example, working with this community in northern Saskatchewan on peyote ceremonies right now, it seems good. But if the door were to slam shut on psychedelics a la 1971 or something like that, I suspect that more harm would come to that community than to me personally. And so there's a kind of meta moral or meta ethical concern that I think we should be alive to in this space. And it's difficult to know how to navigate that exactly, because in the moment it feels like we're on the right side of history. We're doing the right thing. Our intentions are pure or good. But we know from the longue durée that there are real risks involved in opening up these conversations and opening up that exposure.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you can't. There's no crystal ball. Historians can't predict the future like any of us. So, but I think actually to that longue durée idea of the desideratum of objectivity in science itself is a relatively recent artifact. It was only in the 19th century that it began to be, and I think it was because of the discovery or the invention of cameras that idea of separation of subject and object emerged. But prior to that, people, the experiments of Thomas Beddoes and Humphrey Davies on nitrous oxide was very much about the self-experimentation. Arthur Hefter, first experiments with mescaline. So that idea of objectivity is something we perhaps need to question and think more carefully about epistemologically and historically
I
as well.
100% agree, and I do hope that, despite, I don't think that Richard Nixon is lurking around the corner about to, slam close the door, or some version of him. But it is interesting to see where humanities and social science researchers, I think, have a lot at stake in this space that might be a little bit different from what we saw in the past. Not to say they weren't there, but they weren't on the front lines. But here, with exactly those kinds of questions in mind, problematizing the allure of objectivity, those STS scholars who've had, 100 years to really sort of thicken up those studies and think critically about the impact of the Enlightenment, for example, on how we use humans as instruments for determining the true nature of subjectivity or something like that. I think there are more scholars, more researchers, more thinkers who are maybe engaged in these kinds of conversations now than there were in the 1950s. Maybe that's kind of more of a hunch. I mean, I know funding cuts are pretty plentiful across the board, but I do think we have the opportunity to culturally shift this a little bit more, and that's really exciting. Our capacity to communicate has changed dramatically, and you and I could talk all afternoon. But I mean, there's a whole fun story behind the history of communication and technology and, the tech industry and its links with psychedelics as well. That
Yeah, we should probably save
I'm
that
just
for
gonna
another
leave
day.
that there, but
'Cause I think,
I do think that one of the unsung heroes of the psychedelic movement is someone who I don't think is psychedelic at all. Marshall McLuhan, a Canadian philosopher and communications expert, actually had a lot to say about the capacity to communicate as guiding our kind of moral judgment, or the messages in the medium, if you will. The medium is the message, I think, was the Canadian commercial on that. But I think there are even claims that Timothy Leary's Tune In, Turn On, Drop Out was something that Marshall McLuhan had inspired. So I think, stepping outside of psychedelics is the main object of study, and recognizing psychedelics as part of a cultural moment might also be part of the horizon that we see on the future.
The broader public discourses in which we all swim.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, why don't we wrap it up here? How can people find out more about you and your work?
I have a website at the University of Saskatchewan. You can find that. I can probably send it to you.
Put it in show notes. Okay, well, I really appreciate you taking the time. It was great to chat and hear more about your ideas
Thanks so
and
much,
interests.
Ken. Thanks for having me.
Okay, right on. Bye-bye.
The content in this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only. It is not intended to provide medical advice, diagnose, treat, or prevent any disease. Always consult a qualified healthcare professional before making decisions about your health or the use of any substances discussed here. Psychedelic substances remain illegal in many jurisdictions. Listeners and viewers are responsible for knowing and complying with the laws in their area. The views expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the hosts or affiliated organizations. If you choose to explore these topics, please do so with caution, respect, and awareness.